Hello and welcome to part 2 of our analysis of iCAT03. iCAT3 was the final proctored mock in this year's All India National Level CAT Test Series for CAT 18. With iCAT3, we finally enter into the last 2-3 mocks for this season. So as we said earlier, by now you would have finalized your attempt strategy, your strengths and weaknesses for each section and so on. Coming to this mock, as we saw in the verbal section, this was a mock classified as a moderate to tough mock with an average difficulty level per question at around 1.97. Now what does this mean? As explained earlier, if each question is given an LOD or difficulty from 1 to 3, where 1 stands for easy and 3 stands for tough, then the average difficulty per question for any question here was just below 2 or just below moderate. Just to put things into perspective, the average difficulty for CAT has been rated somewhere between 1.9 to 1.95. Coming to the DILR section, the DILR section was rated as tough as expected. Typically, it is the toughest section of the mock as well as of CAT with an average difficulty level of 2.25. Again, to put things into perspective, the difficulty of DILR in CAT has been rated to be between 2.2 to 2.25. So in that sense, this was very similar to a typical DILR section in the actual CAT. Now, how do we analyze a DILR section? Unlike verbal, where we look at the RC from multiple points of view, like the subject matter, the number of questions, the word length, and the difficulty level. In DILR, we do have 2-3 parameters to look at. One obviously is the subject matter, because your comfort level with certain areas like say Venn diagrams or arrangements or tournament based questions can change from area to area. 2, you need to look at whether the set is a pure MCQ set or it's a mixture of MCQ and theta or numerical entry questions, or it's a pure numerical entry set. 3, are the questions direct or conditional? And 4, what's the average difficulty? So here in this graph, we've looked at these aspects and identified the sets that need to be solved. Before that, one aspect which varies completely with respect to the RCs is that you cannot really decide your attempts on the basis of number of questions unlike RCs, because each DILR set has exactly 4 questions. So the structure of DILR is that you have 8 sets with 4 questions each. So the optimal number of attempts in DILR for CAT is assumed to be 4 sets or 16 questions. If the mock or the section is simpler, this can go up to even 19 to 20 questions, that's 5 sets. If it is tougher, it can stay at 12 to 13 questions, that's 3 sets. So anywhere between 3 to 5 sets is what you can try, but 4 sets is more or less the benchmark. So your objective while analyzing the DILR section should be more or less to identify the top 4 sets that should have been tried. Now here, when you look at this particular mock, there are 2 trends that you observe. One, that the first 2 sets here were slightly on the easier side. Of course, a set with an average difficulty above moderate cannot really be called easy. But then, when you consider some of the tougher sets, definitely it's easier compared to that. Then there was one really tough set, followed by a couple of very easy sets and an above moderate set. And the last 2 sets were really tough once again. So there were 3 sets that were definitely very tough. What were these sets on? One was a set on critical path, just as we saw in the previous mock. This was a set on a network, a critical path question. A lot of students find it tough because this is a purely technical area. So they do not really understand the concepts very well, and that is where they struggle in this. Then the next one was a 3 set when on transportation modes. Typically students are able to solve 3 set whens, but here this was a lot more complicated. And the third one here was more of a trap, because when I say it was a trap, I am saying this because it was a standard tournament based question. So the students might have felt that, okay, once I start filling the clues, I am going to get my answers. But once the student would have gone into this set, he would have realized that this was a very, very time consuming and complex set. So definitely these were the sets that should not have been tried in the exam. Coming to the other sets, if I look at these other sets here, the easiest set was the one on circular arrangements, which was a fairly basic set, and any student with bare minimum practice of CAT or MNCT questions could have solved this. Luckily here there were two matrix based sets which generally most students are able to solve. The good part about matrix based sets typically is that if you get the first question right, everything else becomes a cakewalk. Typically the LOD here tends to be slightly higher because the first question is time consuming, and hence it is generally rated as an LOD 3, so this goes up, but on the whole these can be classified as moderate sets. Then there was one caselet on numerical logic, which was a combination of mixed questions, which means a few MCQs and a few thetas. Finally, there was this one set on logical conditions. Now technically, if you observe, this is simpler than both the matrix sets, but I have kept it for last simply because a lot of students find logical conditions to be slightly tougher compared to the pure logic based sets like arrangements, matrix, numerical logic, etc. Again, that is because logical conditions involve some prior knowledge of concepts. Let's have a look at the second graph here, which shows the LOD for each question in each set, and then identify the sets that should have been solved in any particular order. So as we can see here, clearly the 3 set when on transportation looked straightforward because there was just 3 modes of transport, but there was one more parameter here. I think it was more in terms of time spent, and that made it a really tough question to solve in the exam scenario. So this was a very good question to practice at home from a conceptual point of view, but not a good question to solve in an actual mock. So here, looking at this difficulty, I would not have attempted this. Similarly, when I look at this previous question on critical path, there was one moderate question which brought down the difficulty marginally, but on the whole, if you look at the other questions, this can also be classified as a tough set, not worth attempting. Looking at the same logic, the tournament based question, all tough questions, please do not attempt. Whereas when I look at the circular arrangement, this had only easy questions, so the arrangement, and I'll show you, the arrangement could have been done pretty quickly, so definitely worth attempting. If you look at both these matrix based sets, as I mentioned earlier, the first question has been classified as tough because you would have needed some time to solve it, but after that everything could have been done directly. Now this has been classified as moderate mainly because such a set requires anywhere around 15 minutes on an average, and that is where the classification of this set is more as moderate. So when I look at the number of attempts here, I would say that the circular and the two matrix sets were definite attempts for this particular mock. For the fourth set, I would have picked either the caselet if you were not comfortable with logical conditions, or logical conditions if you were comfortable with it. Of course, if you were able to do these 4 sets and then wanted to attempt the 5th one, that would always be a great performance. But at a bare minimum, doing these 3 and then any one of these 2 would have given you close to 16 attempts, which would have been a good performance for this particular section in the mock. Let's have a look at one or two sets here. We will not solve the sets, but look at the approach and why they should have been solved or not solved. So the very first one, there are some boys and some girls in a school. So there are categories, either short or overweight, underweight. Then there are these ratios given, that the boys who are tall as well as underweight is maximum possible. 1/3 of the students who are tall, underweight. So you'll observe that for each gender there will be 4 categories: short and overweight, tall and overweight, short and underweight, and tall and underweight. And then this will apply for boys, this will apply for girls, and it will also apply for total students. Then using these clues, you will need to keep filling the values and arrive at the final answer. The only challenge as far as this set is concerned is that every question asks you for a minimum and maximum value. So that is something that is pretty challenging, because it's not that you know one value and everything can be done very quickly. That is why we kept it as a 4th possibility. Whereas if I look at this second set, which was the matrix, here we say there are 6 faculty teaching 6 subjects, and each faculty takes 2 classes, so that's 6 days, so 12 lectures, 2 lectures on each day, and no faculty takes 2 lectures on the same day. Then there are all these clues. So once you start filling everything, you will get all your answers. Another good part is that all these questions are MCQs. So there's just one question with a cannot be determined. So when you consider the rest of the questions, apart from this, when you consider the rest of the questions, you will observe that every question has clearly defined answers or options. So this is something that should definitely have been tried, because even if you spend 15 minutes, the chances of you getting full return on a set like this are extremely high. Looking at this third set, observe there's one table here with certain clues given: matches played, wins, losses, etc., runs scored, runs conceded, etc. But then if you look, the number of clues that are given here, or the rules that are given here, is huge. When we look at this and you try to solve it in an exam scenario, this becomes an extremely tough question to solve in an exam. So while this is a good question to solve at home, to practice tournament based question, this is definitely not something that you should touch in the exam. The fourth set, which we called the easiest, was this, where we said that which was a circular arrangement, where we said 8 people sit down for dinner on a round table, and then all these clues are given that certain people are sitting opposite certain people. Again, you will observe that this was all MCQs. So using the options also, it would have been easier to solve the questions. But in general, the question was so simple that this should definitely have been tried in the exam. The next question, the one which was on logical conditions, was actually a mixture of logical conditions and relationships, which means that there were 4 people: Mr. Sharma, his wife, son and daughter. Their professions were given, but then there were certain clues that if the singer and dancer are of the same sex or same gender, then the dancer is older than the singer, etc. So for each of the clues, you had to arrive at certain conditions and then reach the answers, where you would map each person with the gender and the profession. So when you did that, you had to ensure that if you apply one clue and arrive at a combination, you do not end up violating the other clues. That was the most important point for this particular set. Even if you skipped this in the exam, it was important to solve such a set at home because it would have given you good practice for questions on logical conditions. The next set again on matrix was something that we said was easy, where you had 5 distances in terms of races. You had 5 participants, their ranks, and then each person got a different rank in each race. So you had to map each of those ranks. Again, fairly doable. All the questions were MCQs here. So that was something that would have helped you solve this question faster. The last 2 questions that we mentioned. So this one was a small network shown here. But the aspect here was that you had water requirements given, and then the water flow from each city to every other city or town had to be found using the clues in the question. So that would have taken certain time, plus it required knowledge of input and output in a network. So considering the other sets, this was definitely something that I would not have tried in the exam, but at home. The last one that we spoke about was something fairly simple if you started looking at it. That 12 million people who live in Mumbai, 50% travel in local trains, 50% bus and 35% auto. Some do not travel. So you would start making the when, you would get the value of local train as 6 million, BST as 6 million and so on. But after that, you also had something called average time spent in local trains is so much, then BST is so much. And then people traveling in local trains spend an average time. So there were 2 parameters in this when. And then mapping both these parameters to each part of the set was a difficult time. That is where this set really became difficult. So again, this could be called a trap because while you started reading it, this looked very doable. But once you went deeper and deeper into this became a more difficult set. On the whole, if we were to classify this section, we would say that this was a tough section in a moderate to tough mock. More or less, it was on the lines of the actual CAT. So here, it was possible to solve 4 sets out of 8. Anywhere close to 16 attempts would be a good performance for this particular section. In part 3 of this analysis, we will look at the quant section. The analysis for the verbal section as well as all our previous mocks is available on our official YouTube channel given in the link here. You can subscribe to our channel by clicking on this link. Also, you can receive notifications every time a new video is put up by hitting the bell button. Feel free to post your comments, feedback or questions on the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.